$1.8 billion. That's the amount the top 10 salary teams paid their players in total for this NBA season. More than 60% of the total amount of paid contracts to players across the NBA. They were consolidated in these top 10 teams, with 8 of those teams paying the luxury tax, which cost the franchise even more money to essentially pay a fee for having such a high payroll. The Golden State Warriors, for example, who paid the highest payroll in the league this season at over $206 million, paid nearly the amount their total players made in salary this season in luxury tax alone at $176.8 million. $382 million is what the Warriors roster cost owner Joe Lacob this season, all for a play-in exit as the 10th seed in the Western Conference. But while most fans will criticize the Warriors for their mismanagement of money for a mediocre basketball team, they're not the only ones. In fact, 8 of the top 10 highest paid salary teams this season have already been eliminated from the playoffs or didn't even qualify for the postseason. So why? Why, you might ask? With the teams paying the most money to their players continuing to fall short of expectations? And why would they continue to do so going forward when teams with lower cap sheets continue to outperform them? Well, it's likely that you're not going to be seeing that. The days of having 3 or more players on max or near max level deals on the same roster and spending whatever it takes to win a championship are over. And a lot of it has to do with the new CBA rules and the changing landscape of the NBA, where we'll see the disparity between max contracts and minimum deals and that massive gap start to close a bit. Obviously, we'll always still have teams with higher payrolls than others, and of course those insane supermax level deals, but teams are no longer incentivized to spend like money grows on trees, especially when you're not able to build out a well-balanced roster with enough depth to complement your stars. So let's talk about it a little more and what that would look like in practice. As always, if you're new to the channel and you like this type of content, then be sure to subscribe to help the channel grow, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, the only 2 teams that remain in playoff contention among the top 10 highest paying teams are the Boston Celtics and the Denver Nuggets, who are the 4th and 6th highest salary teams respectively, which are the 2 teams, in my opinion, I believe will be headed to the NBA Finals this season. But of the other 8 highest paying teams, all luxury tax teams, you have the Warriors, who were eliminated in the play-in. The Heat, Lakers, Pelicans, and Sixers were all play-in teams, but were able to make it into the playoffs, but have all been bounced in the first round, one of which was swept, 2 lost in 5 games, and the other losing in 6. Then there was also the Phoenix Suns, who finished 6th in the West after an up-and-down regular season. They were swept by the Timberwolves in the first round, and the Bucks and Sixers, who both had home court advantage in their respective series, were taken out in 6 games. So while you can point to one individual team and say it was a disappointing season relative to expectations, with most of these teams having championship aspirations, you take a look around and you realize they're not the only ones. Teams that are stacked with superstar level talent aren't able to muster their way out of the first round, with most finishing in the play-in territory in the regular season standings. Why? Why would teams with so much talent continue to fall short of expectations? Well, it's for a few reasons, but let's start with the most obvious, and that's the new rules of the CBA, particularly with the new luxury tax aprons being put in place, placing even more penalties on the highest payroll teams. We talked about this before, but teams are now disincentivized to spend large sums of money on their payroll. Prior to the new CBA, teams that spent a certain amount over their salary cap by way of exceptions would be subject to what the league calls the luxury tax, and you'd be taxed at a certain rate. Essentially, you could look at it like a fee for going over that line, and the pool of money obtained from all the teams that paid into the luxury tax would be dispersed to the rest of the teams in the NBA who did not pay the tax. So while it's easy for fans to criticize their own teams for ducking the tax to save a little bit of money and not paying that fee, well, they actually get a bonus as well, in the form of a share of the pool of money paid by the luxury tax teams. So whether you like it or not, it's actually smart business to avoid paying the tax if you don't have a title contending roster. But regardless, under the old CBA, that was the only quote-unquote penalty, if you will, for overspending on your payroll, paying a tax bill for your high payroll. But under the new CBA, the league implemented 2 aprons over the luxury tax line. By exceeding these thresholds, you are penalized even more than simply paying more in taxes. For example, the NBA's luxury tax threshold was set at $165 million this past season. The first apron was set at $7 million above that line, and the second apron $17.5 million above the threshold. Thus, if your team spent more than $182 million in payroll, you were a second apron team, which only 4 teams exceeded that mark this season, being the Warriors, Clippers, Suns, and the Boston Celtics. If you're a team that falls below the first apron but still above the luxury tax, all you do is pay the associated luxury tax as you would before under the old CBA rules. But above those aprons, here are the penalties you're subjected to. For first apron teams, your ability to make trades is impacted. You're required to match salaries in a trade within 110% of the outgoing salary, whereas that number was 125% for non-tax paying teams. They also cannot take on more money in a trade than they send out. In addition to this, teams are not able to acquire players in a sign and trade in the offseason if the incoming salary keeps them above the apron. And then if you're a second apron team, you're subjected to even more penalties, where you're no longer able to use your taxpayer mid-level exception. In other words, signing free agents to the mid-level to be able to operate over the cap. That is now taken away. First-round picks 7 years out into the future can no longer be traded, which may sound like nothing, but is actually significant, as it usually is a pretty big trade chip for contending teams who are looking to package more enticing deals to acquire win-now players. For example, the Suns, who already don't have any first-round picks to trade through 2030, are also not able to trade their pick in 2031 because they're over the second apron, while teams below the second apron still have that asset to be able to trade should they look to do so. In addition to that, salaries cannot be aggregated or combined in a trade for a single player. And then finally, and the one that has arguably the biggest impact on the distant future, where teams are still assessing the potential consequences of being a second apron team, but if a team remains in the second apron 3 out of 5 seasons, their first round pick will automatically move to the end of that round. In other words, say you've been a second apron team for 3 of the last 5 seasons, and let's say you had a bad year, a worse than expected season, and you missed the playoffs and become a lottery team. Kind of like the Warriors did this year. Instead of getting the 13th pick, which is what the Warriors are slated to get, that pick would actually move to the end of the first round and become the 30th pick, and every team behind them would jump up 1 pick. Now, of course, because this is the first season in which the new tax aprons have been introduced, we won't know, or at least won't see this rule go into effect until at least 5 seasons from now, but that's a huge deterrent for a team to have such a high payroll, not only for the fat tax bill, but having limited ways to improve and round out your roster with your inability to aggregate players in a trade, not being able to use your exceptions, and potentially to see your draft pick pushed back to the end of the first round. Thus, teams are really going to have to rethink how they go about spending their money going forward. And that couldn't be more evident with what you're seeing transpire this postseason, with so many luxury tax teams seeing early exits in the playoffs. And the biggest drawback that you're seeing currently among the highest paying teams is they have their max level stars or higher salary players they were able to retain because they own their bird rights. And then there's this massive gap between those guys who are making upwards of 30, 40, sometimes $50+ million annually to guys who are making minimum or near minimum deals, around $2 to $3 million a year. Let's use the Suns as an example. Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal are making a combined $150 million going into next season, all of them making close to $50 million each. You then have Jusuf Nurkic, who is going to be making $18.1 million, which puts them already over the luxury tax line with just those 4 players alone. And then you see a massive drop-off, with Nasir Little being the next highest paid player on that roster going into next season at $6.7 million, while the rest of their players are all on vet minimum deals. An incredibly top-heavy team with absolutely no depth and heavily reliant on their max-level players. Now, I already went in on why this Suns roster does not work, even at the top, between their big 3 in a prior video, but even if their big 3 did complement each other well, and the chemistry was there, and everything was grooving between just those 3, the rest of their roster would be an absolute dumpster, making it very difficult to remain competitive for the whole game, and being competitive for the whole season should one of your star players get injured. The same applies to teams like the Warriors or the Clippers. Heavy salaries for Kawhi, Paul George, James Harden. For the Warriors, Steph, Clay, Draymond, Andrew Wiggins, while they're challenged to fill out the rest of the roster like they used to when they had the ability to use their mid-level exception, their biannual exception, and even pick up veteran players off of the buyout market. Even for the Boston Celtics, a team you could argue is the most complete team in the NBA right now, and the favorites to win the title this year. But if they don't win, and those salaries of Jaylen Brown, the extension for Drew Holiday, and a likely Supermax extension for Jason Tatum, all those kick in, as well as potential extensions for Kristaps Porzingis and Derek White, they're poised to become the first second apron team at least 3 times over a 5-year period. Will they be able to keep their roster together, knowing the financial constraints posed on them by the league? They're not going to be able to pay everybody, and a lot of their guys further on down the bench are going to command higher than minimum contracts. I mentioned this before, but the days of super teams, big three, superstars teaming up together are gone. Because while in theory it may sound good, and on paper it gives them a chance at winning a title, unbalanced top-heavy rosters no longer work in the NBA, with the new rules and constraints of the CBA. Now you can debate whether the new CBA is good or bad for the league, whether it offers more parity and an equal advantage to small market teams, but wherever you stand, the new rules are in place, and will remain so until 2030, when the new CBA is up for being renegotiated. Until then, you're going to see a drastic shift in the league where teams are going to be more hesitant to try and stack star players and large long-term deals and begin preferring a more balanced, well-rounded roster. It's going to take a while for the dust to settle under the new CBA and seeing the change in approach from franchises around the league. But we'd love to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.